The baker woke that morning to a silence so complete it felt like a weight pressing against his ears. The usual chorus of birdsong absent from the August dawn, the roosters quiet in their coops, even the strayed dogs that normally prowled the alleys, making no sound as the first pale light crept across the painted walls of his shop on the Via dell'Abbondanza. Marcus Popedius Priscus had lived in Pompeii for all of his 43 years, had risen before dawn on thousands of mornings to kindle his ovens and begin the day's baking, and he knew the rhythms of the city as intimately as he knew the feel of dough beneath his hands. But this morning was different in ways he could not quite name, a strangeness in the air that made the hair on his arms stand up and filled him with a sourceless unease that he tried to dismiss as he went about his familiar routines. He could not know as he stoked his ovens and mixed his first batch of dough that he was living the last normal moments of his life, that within hours the mountain that had dominated the horizon of his world for as long as anyone could remember would tear itself apart with a violence that would erase his city from the living earth and preserve it for eternity in ash and stone, a moment frozen in time, a catastrophe so complete and so sudden that the people caught in it would have no chance to understand what was happening to them before everything they knew ceased to exist. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The city of Pompeii on that August morning in the year 79 AD was a thriving provincial town of perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, nestled on the western coast of Italy about 5 miles from the mountain the Romans called Vesuvius. The city had grown wealthy from the fertile volcanic soil that surrounded it, soil that produced abundant grain, grapes, and olives, and from its position on the road that connected Rome to the southern ports. Its streets were lined with shops and workshops, its markets busy with merchants selling everything from fresh fish to exotic spices imported from the far reaches of the empire. Grand houses belonging to wealthy merchants and retired officials featured elaborate frescoes, intricate mosaics, and gardens with fountains and statuary. Public baths offered both luxury and social gathering places. The amphitheater could seat the entire population for gladiatorial games. The forum, surrounded by temples and government buildings, was the heart of civic and religious life. The inhabitants of Pompeii were Roman citizens and subjects, a mix of native Italians, Greek colonists whose ancestors had settled the region centuries before, and immigrants from across the empire drawn by commercial opportunities. They spoke Latin in official contexts and a mixture of Latin and Oscan, the ancient local language, in daily life. They worshipped the Roman gods, Jupiter, Juno, Venus, Mars, alongside older local deities and newer imports from the east like Isis and Mithras. They attended the theater, the baths, the games. They gossiped in the forum, conducted business in the basilica, worshipped in the temples. They were, in most respects, ordinary people living ordinary lives in what they assumed was an ordinary town, in an empire that seemed eternal. But Pompeii was not, in fact, ordinary, though its inhabitants had lived with their particular circumstance for so long that they had ceased to think it remarkable. The mountain that loomed over the city, its slopes covered with vineyards and farms, was not a mountain at all, but a volcano, though the Romans had no word for such a thing and did not understand what it was. Vesuvius had been quiet for so long, centuries, perhaps longer than human memory reached, that no one alive had any reason to fear it. It was simply part of the landscape, a prominent feature of the horizon, a source of the rich soil that made the region prosperous. There had been warning signs, though few recognized them as such. 17 years earlier, in 62 AD, a powerful earthquake had struck the region, damaging buildings throughout Pompeii and the surrounding towns. The damage had been extensive. Temples collapsed, houses cracked, water pipes broken, walls toppled. The city had been in the process of repairing and rebuilding ever since, a task that had proven more extensive than anyone anticipated. Many public buildings still showed signs of earthquake damage. Some wealthy families had chosen to move away rather than face the expense and uncertainty of reconstruction. But most people had stayed, rebuilding their homes and businesses, adapting to the occasional tremors that continued to shake the region in the years that followed. These tremors had become part of life. People noticed them, paused in their work when the ground shook, then continued once it stopped. The tremors varied in intensity, some barely perceptible, others strong enough to knock objects off shelves or crack walls. In the days immediately before that August morning, the tremors had been frequent and occasionally quite strong. Wells and springs had been behaving strangely, with water levels fluctuating unpredictably. Some wells had gone dry while others had begun to flow more abundantly. The sea near the shore had withdrawn slightly, exposing rocks and mud that were normally underwater. Animals had been acting strangely for several days. Dogs barked at nothing, horses were skittish and difficult to control. Birds gathered in unusual flocks or fell silent. Snakes and other creatures that normally hid during daylight hours were seen in the open. These signs, which might have been recognized by people living in a region with recent volcanic experience, meant nothing to the inhabitants of Pompeii, who had no framework for understanding what they indicated. The strange behavior was noted, discussed, attributed to the heat or the season or the will of the gods, but not seen as cause for alarm or evacuation. Marcus the baker, as he worked in his shop in the pre-dawn hours, felt the stone floor beneath his feet trembling slightly, a sensation that had become so common he barely registered it. He was more concerned with the practical matters of his trade, ensuring his ovens reached the right temperature, mixing his dough with the correct proportions of flour and water, timing his baking so that fresh bread would be ready when customers began their day. His shop was located on one of the main streets of the city, perfectly positioned to catch both local residents on their morning routines and travelers passing through. His bread was known for its quality, and he took pride in his work, in the golden crusts and soft interiors, in the satisfied customers who returned day after day. His household was waking behind the shop. His wife, Julia, emerged from the sleeping quarters to begin her own morning tasks, supervising the slaves who would clean the house, prepare the day's meals, and help in the shop when customers became numerous. Their 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, were still sleeping, having been allowed to stay up late the previous evening for a neighbor's birthday celebration. Marcus could hear Julia moving about, the familiar domestic sounds that had been the backdrop of his life for nearly 20 years of marriage. In the grand house of Lucius Caecilius Iucundus, a wealthy merchant whose business affairs were known throughout the region, the household was also stirring. Lucius himself, a man in his 50s who had made his fortune as an Argentarius, a banker and dealer in property, was already awake in his study, reviewing accounts by lamplight. His house was one of the finest in Pompeii, featuring elaborate frescoes depicting mythological scenes, floors covered in intricate mosaics, a central garden with a fountain and enough rooms to accommodate not just his immediate family, but also his business staff, his slaves, and occasional important guests. Lucius was particularly concerned this morning with a property transaction that had been complicated by the earthquake damage so many buildings still bore. The seller was attempting to renegotiate the price downward, claiming repairs would be more expensive than initially estimated. Lucius, who had built his fortune on careful assessment of property values and shrewd negotiation, was drafting a response that would maintain his position while not alienating a potentially valuable business associate. He worked with the careful precision that had characterized his business dealings for decades, using a stylus to scratch his thoughts onto a wax tablet, occasionally pausing to consider his phrasing. In the house of the Vetti, another grand residence belonging to 2 wealthy freedmen brothers who had prospered in the wine trade, the household slaves were beginning the day's work. They drew water from the impluvium, the decorative pool in the atrium that collected rainwater. They swept the mosaic floors, prepared the cooking fires, laid out the materials their masters would need for the day's business. The house was filled with art that proclaimed the wealth and taste of its owners. Frescoes of cupids engaged in various trades, paintings of mythological scenes, a famous image in the entrance hall of Priapus that both amused visitors and asserted the household's prosperity and virility. Throughout the city, similar scenes were unfolding. In the modest homes of shopkeepers and craftsmen, families were waking to another working day. In the even more modest dwellings of the poor, in rooms rented above workshops or in small houses on the back streets, people stirred in the early light. In the grand villas on the outskirts of the city, where wealthy landowners maintained country retreats, household staffs were preparing for the day. In the brothel near the Forum, where explicit frescoes decorated the walls and small rooms provided space for the city's sex workers to conduct their business, the night's customers were departing, and the women were preparing for the day ahead. The slaves who made up a significant portion of Pompeii's population, perhaps a third or more of all inhabitants, were already at work or preparing to begin. Slavery in the Roman world was ubiquitous and took many forms. Some slaves were household servants who might be treated almost as family members and who might eventually earn or be granted their freedom. Others were agricultural laborers working the farms and vineyards surrounding the city. Still others worked in workshops, in construction, in the docks loading and unloading ships. The lives of slaves varied enormously depending on their circumstances, but all shared the fundamental condition of being property, owned by others, subject to their master's will. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the city came fully to life. Shops opened their shutters onto the street, creating the covered walkways that lined Pompeii's main thoroughfares. Merchants arranged their goods on counters built into the shop fronts. The smell of fresh bread from bakeries like Marcus's mingled with other morning scents. Smoke from cooking fires, the earthy smell of freshly swept streets, the pungent odor from the fulleries where urine was used to clean cloth, the various smells of animals, food, people, and industry that characterized any ancient city. The streets began to fill with people going about their business. Wealthy citizens were carried in litters by slaves, their curtains drawn against the dust, or open to allow the occupants to greet acquaintances. Merchants walked purposefully toward the Forum or the Basilica where business was conducted. Women went to market or visited neighbors. Children played in the streets or hurried to school. Slaves carried water, delivered goods, ran errands for their masters. The sound of voices filled the air. Greetings called from shop to shop, vendors advertising their wares, children's laughter, the arguments and negotiations of business, conversations between friends. The Forum, the great open plaza at the center of civic life, began to fill with people. Surrounded by colonnaded walkways and dominated by the Temple of Jupiter at its northern end, the Forum was where public life happened. Political announcements were posted here. Religious ceremonies took place at the temples. Business was conducted in the Basilica, a large covered hall on the southern side. People came to the Forum to see and be seen, to transact business, to hear news, to participate in the life of the community. Near the Forum was the Macellum, the meat and fish market, where vendors were setting up their stalls for the day's trade. Fresh fish from the nearby coast, meat from animals slaughtered that morning, vegetables from the surrounding farms, all would be sold here to household slaves and free women doing their shopping. The market was always busy, always loud with the calls of vendors, the negotiations over price, the discussions of quality and freshness that characterized ancient commerce. At the public baths, the Stabian baths near the city center and the newer Forum baths, staff were preparing the facilities for the day's visitors. The Hippocos systems that heated the hot rooms were being stoked. The pools were being cleaned and filled. The exercise yards were being swept. The baths were more than just places for washing. They were social centers where people of all classes mingled, conducted business, gossiped, relaxed, and participated in the communal life of the city. A visit to the baths was a daily ritual for many Romans, a combination of hygiene, exercise, and social interaction that was central to urban life. In the amphitheater on the eastern edge of the city, preparations were underway for games that had been scheduled for that afternoon. The amphitheater at Pompeii was one of the oldest permanent amphitheaters in the Roman world, built around 70 BC, and could seat approximately 20,000 spectators, more than the entire population of the city, as it drew crowds from the surrounding region. The games that had been planned for this day included gladiatorial combats and possibly animal hunts. Though the evidence does not tell us exactly what was scheduled, what is certain is that the amphitheater would not be used that day, that the games would never take place, that the preparations would be for nothing. It was approximately noon, perhaps slightly after, when the mountain exploded. The eruption began with little warning, though in retrospect the signs had been there: the earthquake swarm of the previous days, the strange behavior of animals, the unusual quiet of that morning. But the actual eruption, when it came, was sudden and catastrophic. Vesuvius, which had been building pressure in its magma chamber for centuries, perhaps for 1,000 years or more, finally breached the rock that had sealed it. The explosion was unlike anything the modern world has experienced. The sound would have been heard hundreds of miles away. The force was equivalent to many atomic bombs. The first visible sign would have been the column of ash and pumice that shot into the sky, rising at tremendous speed to a height of perhaps 15 miles or more. Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the eruption from across the Bay of Naples and later described it in letters that are our best contemporary account, compared the column to a pine tree, a tall straight trunk rising into the sky and then spreading out at the top into a canopy. The column was composed of pulverized rock, volcanic ash, pumice, and gases, all ejected from the volcano with incredible force and speed. The people of Pompeii, going about their daily business, would have heard the explosion, a sound beyond anything they had experienced, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. They would have felt the ground shake with a violence that dwarfed the tremors they had been experiencing. And then they would have looked up and seen the column rising from Vesuvius, the mountain they had lived beneath all their lives, suddenly transformed into something monstrous and terrifying. The initial reaction, we can imagine, was confusion and fear, but not necessarily panic. The Romans were familiar with natural disasters. Earthquakes, floods, fires were all common enough. Their instinct would have been to seek shelter, to protect their families, to wait for the danger to pass. Many probably went indoors, thinking that the sturdy walls of their houses would protect them. Some may have gathered valuables, preparing to flee if necessary. Others might have gone to temples to pray and make offerings to the gods. But this was not a danger that would pass. The eruption continued and intensified. The column rising from Vesuvius grew larger, darker, more ominous, and then, perhaps an hour after the eruption began, the first pumice began to fall on Pompeii. Pumice is volcanic rock so filled with gas bubbles that it is light enough to float on water. The pumice that began raining down on Pompeii was white or light gray, ranging in size from pebbles to fist-sized rocks, and it fell in enormous quantities. It accumulated on roofs, in streets, in gardens, everywhere, at a rate of several inches per hour. The fall of pumice changed everything. This was not something that could be waded out indoors. The pumice was accumulating so rapidly that it threatened to collapse roofs. The fragments were hot, not burning hot, but uncomfortably warm to touch, and they filled the air with choking dust. Visibility dropped as the sky darkened under the spreading cloud. The sun became dim and then vanished entirely as the ash cloud spread overhead, turning midday into twilight and then into darkness. Now the people of Pompeii had to make decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. Should they stay in their homes, trying to shore up their roofs against the accumulating pumice? Should they flee, trying to make their way out of the city and away from the mountain? Should they seek shelter in the strongest buildings, the temples, the baths, the basilica? There was no right answer, no precedent to guide them, no experience to draw upon. This was utterly outside anything anyone had ever encountered. Marcus, the baker, his shop now closed as customers vanished from the streets, gathered his family in the main room of his house. The pumice had begun falling just as the lunch hour approached, and within minutes it had become impossible to conduct business. He could hear the stones pounding on the roof tiles, a constant drumming that grew louder as the fall intensified. His wife Julia was frightened, holding their daughter close. Their son, still young enough to see adventure and disaster, wanted to go outside and see what was happening. Marcus forbade it, knowing instinctively that exposure to the falling stones would be dangerous. They had some food, some water, oil for lamps as the daylight failed. Marcus's plan, if it could be called a plan, was to wait. Surely this would stop. Surely the mountain would quiet. The stones would cease falling, and life would return to normal. He did not want to abandon his shop, his livelihood, everything he had built. And where would they go? The streets were filling with pumice. Travel would be difficult and dangerous. Better to shelter here, in their own home, and wait for the crisis to pass. Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, the wealthy merchant, made a different decision. When the pumice began falling, he was in his study, still working on his correspondence. He emerged to find his household in confusion, slaves unsure what to do, his wife frightened, his children crying. Lucius, who had built his fortune on careful assessment of risk and decisive action, quickly determined that staying in the city was too dangerous. The pumice was falling too heavily, accumulating too quickly. The darkness that had descended was absolute and terrifying. They needed to leave while they still could. He ordered his household to prepare for evacuation, take only what could be easily carried, some food, water, valuables, warm clothing. They would leave immediately, making their way through the city to the gates and then away from the mountain, toward the coast or inland toward Naples. He did not know where they would go, but he knew they could not stay here. His instinct for self-preservation, honed through decades of careful business dealings, told him that this disaster was not something that would quickly pass. Throughout the city, similar decisions were being made, each family or household choosing to stay or to go based on their own assessment of the danger, their own resources, their own fears and hopes. Some, like Lucius, chose to flee immediately. They gathered what they could and made their way through the darkened streets, stumbling through accumulating pumice that made walking difficult, making for the city gates. The gates themselves would have been crowded, as others had the same idea, creating bottlenecks where people pushed and struggled to get through. Those who fled early in the first hours after the pumice began falling had the best chance of survival. The fall of pumice, while dangerous and frightening, was not immediately lethal. The stones could injure, the accumulation could trap people in buildings, but the pumice phase of the eruption was survivable if one could get away from the city and away from the mountain. Those who left in those first hours, who pushed through the dark streets and the falling stones and made their way into the countryside, mostly survived. Though their journey would have been harrowing and many would have been injured, but many others chose to stay, at least initially. They sheltered in their homes, in temples, in public buildings. They waited for the disaster to end. They protected their property, their families, their lives as they understood them. And as the hours passed and the pumice continued to fall and the darkness continued and the ground continued to shake with violent tremors, they found themselves increasingly trapped. The pumice accumulated to depths of several feet, then deeper. Roofs began to collapse under the weight. The first floor of many buildings became buried, the pumice reaching to the level of the second floor windows. People who had sheltered inside found themselves trapped in their own homes, the doorways blocked by pumice, the streets impassable. Some tried to dig their way out. Others waited, hoping that help would come, or that the fall would cease. As afternoon turned to evening, though time was difficult to judge in the absolute darkness that had descended, the character of the eruption changed. The column that had been rising from Vesuvius became unstable. The material being ejected could no longer sustain itself in the air, and the column began to collapse, sending pyroclastic surges, fast-moving currents of hot gas and volcanic matter, down the slopes of the mountain. The first of these surges did not reach Pompeii, but they devastated settlements closer to the volcano, including the town of Herculaneum to the west. The people of Pompeii could not see these surges in the darkness, but they would have felt the ground shaking, heard the roaring from the mountain, sensed somehow that the danger was intensifying. Those who had remained in the city now faced a terrible choice. The pumice had made the streets nearly impassable, filling them to depths of 6 feet or more in places. Roofs were collapsing, buildings were being buried. To stay was to risk being trapped and crushed. To flee was to venture into the dark streets filled with pumice, to struggle through the accumulation, to risk falling, being injured, becoming lost in the absolute darkness. Some made the attempt. We know this from the bodies that have been found in the streets of Pompeii. People who died trying to escape, overwhelmed by the conditions or by the surges that would eventually come. These were people who carried small valuables, who were dressed for travel, who were found in positions suggesting they were trying to move through the city when they died. Their stories ended in the dark streets, their bodies buried and preserved by the ash that would soon cover everything. Marcus the baker, his family huddled in the main room of his house, could hear his roof creaking under the weight of the pumice. He had ventured upstairs earlier and tried to push some of the accumulation off the roof, a dangerous and exhausting task in the complete darkness with the pumice still falling. But there was too much, falling too fast. He could not keep ahead of it. Back downstairs, he tried to maintain calm, tried to keep his wife and children from panicking. They had enough food for several days. They had water. They had oil for their lamps. They would wait this out. They had to. But in his heart, Marcus was beginning to understand that this was not something they could simply wait out. The pumice had been falling for hours now with no sign of stopping. The depth outside was such that their door was probably completely buried. The darkness was absolute except for their flickering oil lamps. The air was thick with dust that made breathing difficult. And the sounds from outside, the roaring from the mountain, the crashes as roofs collapsed, the rumbling of the ground, all suggested that the danger was not diminishing, but growing. In the house of Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, now abandoned, the pumice was piling up in the atrium, filling the impluvium, covering the mosaic floors. The carefully tended garden was buried. The frescoes on the walls, which had been painted with such care and expense, were now in rooms filling with volcanic debris. The business records, the wax tablets, the accounts and contracts that had been so important that morning lay on Lucius's desk, soon to be buried and forgotten, though they would eventually be rediscovered by archaeologists centuries later, providing invaluable insight into the business life of a Roman provincial town. Lucius himself was struggling through the countryside south of the city with his family and a few slaves. They had made it out of Pompeii through the Stabiae Gate, but the journey had been nightmarish. The darkness was complete, and they had to feel their way forward, stumbling through the pumice that covered the road. The air was thick with ash and dust that made every breath a struggle. The hot stones falling from the sky struck them repeatedly despite the cushions and blankets they had wrapped around their heads for protection. They could hear others around them in the darkness, the cries and shouts of other refugees, but could see nothing. Lucius's plan was to make for the coast, perhaps to find a boat that could take them away from the disaster. But the coast was miles away, and their progress was agonizingly slow. His wife was exhausted, barely able to continue. One of his slaves had fallen and twisted an ankle badly, slowing them further. They stopped frequently to rest, huddling together in the darkness, before forcing themselves to continue. Lucius had no idea if they were even moving in the right direction. The absolute darkness, the falling pumice, the choking air, the continuous roar from the mountain, all conspired to create a confusion and disorientation that made navigation almost impossible. Throughout the night, and we know from Pliny's account that the eruption continued through the night and into the next day, the people of Pompeii who remained in the city struggled to survive. Some were trapped in their homes as roofs collapsed, buried alive in the pumice. Others died from breathing difficulties, the ash and dust in the air overwhelming their lungs. Still others were injured by falling debris or by the earthquake tremors that continued to shake the region. The living waited in the darkness, hoping that dawn would bring relief, that the eruption would cease, that rescue would come. But when dawn should have come, there was only continued darkness. The ash cloud was so thick, spreading so far that it blocked out the sun. The fall of pumice continued, though the nature of what was falling began to change. Mixed with the white pumice now came darker material, smaller fragments of ash and rock, material that was denser and that packed more tightly when it accumulated. the burden on roofs and structures increased. More buildings collapsed, and then, in the early morning of the second day of the eruption, approximately 7 o'clock on August 25th, though the exact timing is debated, the character of the eruption changed dramatically. The column that had been rising from Vesuvius collapsed completely, and the first pyroclastic surge reached Pompeii. A pyroclastic surge is a fast-moving current of hot gas and volcanic matter that flows down the slopes of a volcano like an avalanche. The surge that hit Pompeii was traveling at perhaps 100 miles per hour and had a temperature of several hundred degrees Celsius, hot enough to kill instantly through heat shock even without direct contact. The surge swept over the city from the north, flowing through the streets, entering buildings through doors and windows, filling every space. It moved with tremendous force, knocking down walls that had survived the pumice fall, toppling columns, destroying structures. But most devastating was the heat. Everything in the path of the surge was subjected to temperatures that killed instantly. People died where they stood or lay, their bodies contorted by the heat, their muscles contracting in cadaveric spasm, creating the characteristic postures that would be revealed when the bodies were eventually excavated. Marcus the baker and his family died in this first surge. They had survived the night, had huddled together in their home as the pumice continued to fall and the darkness continued. When the surge came, they had no warning, no chance to escape. The heat killed them in seconds. Their bodies would be found centuries later in their home, clustered together in the main room, preserved in the ash that followed the surge, their final moments frozen in time. The surge was followed by more ashfall, finer material now that filled in every space, covering the bodies, covering the ruins of buildings, creating the seal that would preserve Pompeii for posterity. Over the next hours, additional surges struck the city, each one adding to the destruction, though by now there was little left to destroy, and few, if any, people left alive to kill. The city was being systematically buried, transformed from a living community into a time capsule that would remain hidden for nearly 1,700 years. Lucius Caecilius Jucundus and his family, having made it several miles from the city, were far enough away to escape the surges. Though they would have felt the heat and been struck by the ash and debris, they survived the eruption, though their journey to safety was harrowing, and several of their slaves died along the way. Lucius eventually made his way to Naples and then to Rome, where he had business connections. He would never return to Pompeii. His house, his business, his carefully accumulated wealth of accounts and connections, all were buried beneath 20 feet of volcanic material. He would have to rebuild his life from what he carried with him and what accounts he could collect from debtors in other cities. He was one of the lucky ones. The eruption continued for another day, gradually diminishing in intensity. The column shrank, the ash fall decreased, the surges ceased. By August 26th, it was over. Vesuvius stood transformed, its summit blown away by the eruption, its slopes covered with new material. The cities and towns around it, Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabiae, Oplontis, were gone, buried beneath volcanic debris. The death toll was in the thousands, though we can never know the exact number. Many had escaped, but many more had died. In the days and weeks that followed, survivors and searchers came to the devastated region, trying to determine what had happened, trying to locate missing family members, trying to salvage what could be salvaged. But there was little to find. The cities were buried so deeply that locating them was difficult. Pompeii was under 20 feet of pumice and ash. Herculaneum was under 60 feet of hardened material that had flowed like wet concrete. The roofs of the tallest buildings were all that showed above the surface in some places, and even these quickly became covered as wind and rain redistributed the material. Some attempts were made to dig down to recover valuables, and there is evidence of tunneling into Pompeii in the immediate aftermath of the eruption. But the task was overwhelming, the depth too great, the risk of collapse too high. Eventually, the survivors gave up. The sites were abandoned, left to nature. Vegetation began to grow on the new slopes. Rain and wind eroded and redistributed the material. Within a generation, the exact location of Pompeii was becoming uncertain. Within a century, it was largely forgotten, Though the name survived in literary references and in local memory, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD was documented by Pliny the Younger in two famous letters written to the historian Tacitus, probably in the year 104 AD. Pliny was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, at Misenum across the Bay of Naples when the eruption began. Pliny the Elder, who was the commander of the Roman fleet and also a naturalist with a keen interest in natural phenomena, decided to investigate the eruption and to render assistance to people trapped on the coast near Vesuvius. He sailed across the bay toward the eruption, a journey of tremendous courage that would cost him his life. He died at Stabiae, probably from the effects of inhaling toxic gases, and his body was recovered the next day. Pliny the Younger, who was 17 at the time, remained at Misenum and witnessed the eruption from a distance. His letters provide our only detailed contemporary account of the event. He describes the pine tree-shaped column, the darkness that descended, the panic of the population, the earthquakes, the ash fall that reached even as far as Misenum. His account is vivid and detailed, providing information that has been invaluable to volcanologists studying the eruption and establishing what is now called a Plinian eruption as a specific category of volcanic event. Pompeii remained buried and largely forgotten for nearly 1,700 years. The site was rediscovered accidentally in 1599 when an architect digging a canal uncovered ancient walls, but he didn't recognize what he had found and the discovery was not pursued. More significant discoveries were made in the early 18th century when the digging of wells and the excavation for other construction projects uncovered ancient artifacts. In 1748, systematic excavation of Pompeii began under the direction of the Spanish military engineer Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre, working for the King of Naples. The excavations revealed something unprecedented, an entire Roman city preserved in extraordinary detail. Unlike most archaeological sites, which consist of ruins degraded by centuries of weather and human activity, Pompeii had been sealed away at a specific moment in time. Buildings stood to their full height, their roofs gone but their walls intact, their painted frescoes still colorful, their mosaics still complete. The everyday objects of Roman life, pottery, tools, furniture, food, jewelry, coins, documents, all survived in the airless seal created by the volcanic material. Most poignant were the bodies. As the excavators dug through the ash, they found cavities in the hardened material, voids shaped like human forms. These were the spaces where bodies had decomposed after being sealed in the ash. An Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who directed the excavations from 1863 to 1875, developed a technique of injecting plaster into these voids, creating casts that revealed the final moments of Pompeii's inhabitants in heartbreaking detail. The casts show people in various attitudes of death, huddled together, reaching for each other, covering their faces, curled in fetal positions. They show adults trying to protect children, families clustered together, individuals caught alone. The excavations at Pompeii have continued, with interruptions, for more than 250 years and are still ongoing. Approximately 2/3 of the city has been excavated, with 1/3 remaining buried. The site has become one of the most famous archaeological locations in the world, attracting millions of visitors annually and providing invaluable insights into Roman life. The preservation is so complete that we can walk through Roman streets, enter Roman homes, see Roman shops and workshops, view the graffiti that ordinary Romans scrawled on walls, read the electoral notices and advertisements they painted on buildings, understand their daily lives in a detail that is possible for almost no other ancient city. We know from the excavations what Marcus the baker's shop looked like, the ovens where he baked his bread, the counter where he sold it, the rooms where his family lived. We know the layout of the house of Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, can see the frescoes on his walls, have read his business records preserved on wax tablets. We know about the prostitutes who worked in the brothel, about the gladiators who trained in their barracks, about the vendors in the markets, about the priests in the temples, about the officials in the government buildings. We know about their food, their clothing, their religion, their entertainment, their business practices, their family structures, their social relationships. We also know something about the last hours of those who died, the positions of the bodies, the objects they carried, their locations throughout the city. All tell stories of desperation and hope, of families staying together, of individuals caught alone, of attempted escapes and failed shelters. A group of gladiators was found in their barracks, along with a richly dressed woman who had apparently sought refuge with them. A dog was found still chained in a courtyard, its body arched in agony as it tried to escape the rising pumice. A pregnant woman was found with her young daughter. A man was found with a substantial amount of coins, suggesting he had tried to save his wealth. The tragedy of Pompeii resonates across the centuries because of its sudden completeness. This was not a city that declined gradually, or was destroyed in war and rebuilt. It was a thriving community that was simply erased in a day, its people killed, its buildings buried, its existence ended in a geological instant. The preservation, paradoxically, makes the catastrophe more immediate and more moving. We can see exactly what was lost, can understand in concrete detail what these people's lives were like, what they valued, how they lived, and how they died. The excavations have also provided scientific information about the eruption itself. Volcanologists have studied the deposits, analyzed the different layers of material, calculated the energy of the eruption, estimated the column height, modeled the pyroclastic surges, and used all this information to understand how such eruptions work. The 79 AD eruption of Vesuvius has become the type example of a specific kind of explosive eruption, now called a Plinian eruption in honor of Pliny the Younger, who first described it. The understanding gained from studying Pompeii has helped scientists predict and prepare for similar eruptions at other volcanoes around the world. But Vesuvius is not just a historical curiosity. It remains an active and dangerous volcano. It has erupted many times since 79 AD, though never with quite the same intensity. The most recent eruption was in 1944, a relatively small event that nonetheless caused significant damage and killed dozens of people. The volcano is closely monitored by scientists who watch for signs of renewed activity. What makes Vesuvius particularly dangerous is not just its explosive potential, but its location. It sits in one of the most densely populated regions of Europe. The modern city of Naples, with a metropolitan population of more than 3 million people, lies within the potential danger zone. Dozens of towns sit on the slopes of the volcano or in the surrounding area. An eruption comparable to the one in 79 AD would be a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The lessons of Pompeii, both scientific and human, remain relevant. The scientific lessons have helped save lives at other volcanic sites where monitoring and evacuation have prevented disasters similar to what befell Pompeii. The human lessons remind us of the fragility of our existence, of how quickly the ordinary routines of life can be shattered by natural forces beyond our control, of how the same processes that create the fertility and beauty of volcanic regions also contain the seeds of destruction. In the ruins of Pompeii, preserved beneath the ash, we can see reflections of ourselves. The bakery with its ovens and flour stores reminds us that people in 79 AD needed bread just as we do. The houses with their gardens and frescoes remind us that people wanted beauty in their lives, comfort, aesthetic pleasure. The graffiti scratched on walls, declarations of love, political slogans, crude jokes, simple notices, remind us that ordinary people in ancient times had the same range of emotions and concerns as we do. The businesses and shops remind us of the universal human drive to trade, to make a living, to prosper. The bodies frozen in their final moments remind us of our mortality. The family groups huddled together remind us that in crisis people turn to those they love. The individuals found alone remind us that death sometimes comes in isolation. The people who died trying to escape remind us of the human instinct for survival, the determination to keep going even in the face of overwhelming disaster. The people who died sheltering in place remind us that sometimes there are no good choices, that circumstances can overwhelm the best efforts at survival. Walking through Pompeii today, along the ancient streets with their deep ruts worn by centuries of cartwheels, past the houses with their painted walls and mosaic floors, through the forum where civic life once flourished, into the amphitheater where crowds once cheered gladiatorial combats that never happened on that fateful day. One experiences a profound connection to the past. This is not ancient history presented as abstract facts and dates. This is the actual physical reality of Roman life, preserved in painful detail by the same catastrophe that destroyed it. The plaster casts of the victims, displayed in various locations around the site, are particularly affecting. These are not artistic representations or reconstructions. They are the actual shapes of actual people at the actual moment of their death. We see their clothing, their postures, their final gestures. We see a father trying to shield his children. We see someone covering their face against the ash and heat. We see the twisted postures caused by the heat of the pyroclastic surge. These are not statistics or abstractions. These are individuals, each one a complete human life with all its complexity, ended in an instant by forces beyond comprehension. The tragedy is compounded by its unexpectedness. The people of Pompeii had no reason to expect what happened. They had lived beneath the mountain for generations without incident. The earthquakes that preceded the eruption were concerning but not unprecedented. When the eruption began, they had no framework for understanding what was happening, no prior experience with volcanic eruptions, no scientific knowledge that might have helped them predict what was coming. They made decisions based on incomplete information and incorrect assumptions, and many of those decisions proved fatal. This reminds us of our own vulnerability to disasters we may not foresee or understand. The residents of Pompeii were not foolish or negligent. They were ordinary people living their lives in what seemed to be an ordinary place. The fact that the place sat next to an active volcano was not something they could know in any meaningful way. The geologic timescales on which volcanoes operate are so different from human timescales that a volcano can seem dormant for many human lifetimes while remaining very much active in geologic terms. We face similar uncertainties. We build our cities in earthquake zones, on floodplains, along coasts vulnerable to hurricanes and tsunamis, near volcanoes, in areas subject to tornadoes or wildfires. We do this partly out of necessity. The same features that make these places dangerous also often make them attractive or productive. Volcanic soils are fertile. Coasts provide access to ocean resources and trade routes. River valleys offer water and transportation. Earthquake zones often coincide with mountain building and the resources that come with it. We accept the risks, often implicitly, as part of the bargain of living in these places. But Pompeii reminds us that the risks are real, that disasters can and do happen, that the ordinary can become catastrophic in moments. The morning of August 24th, 79 AD began as an ordinary day. By evening, a city was dying. By the next morning, it was dead, its buildings buried, its people gone, its existence ended. The transformation was complete and irreversible. No amount of wishing or praying or effort could undo what had happened. The survivors could only move forward, carrying with them the trauma of what they had experienced and the memories of what they had lost. The story of Pompeii is ultimately a story about time, about the deep time of geology and the brief time of human lives, about the moment when these two timescales intersected with catastrophic results. Vesuvius had been building toward eruption for centuries or millennia, pressure accumulating in its magma chamber, the system approaching instability. The people of Pompeii lived their brief lives oblivious to these processes, as we all live oblivious to the slow workings of the earth beneath our feet. And then, on one particular day, the two time scales met. The geologic process reached its culmination at the same moment that thousands of human lives were going about their daily routines. The result was the destruction of those lives and the creation of an archaeological site that has taught us more about Roman civilization than perhaps any other single location. In the ruins of Marcus the baker's shop, archaeologists found the carbonized remains of loaves of bread preserved by the ash. These loaves, baked nearly 2,000 years ago, are recognizably bread, round, scored with radial lines, with a texture and shape that would not seem out of place in a modern bakery. They speak to the continuity of human culture, to the ways in which basic human needs and practices remain constant, even as civilizations rise and fall. Marcus baked bread for his neighbors using techniques that were ancient in his time and that remain fundamentally similar today. The eruption that killed him and destroyed his city has become ancient history, but bread remains bread, and the impulse that led him to wake before dawn to provide for his community remains recognizable and comprehensible. The excavations continue at Pompeii, revealing new details, refining our understanding, preserving what remains for future generations to study. Conservation is an ongoing challenge. The site has been exposed to weather and tourism for centuries since excavation began, and maintaining the paintings, mosaics, and structures requires constant effort. New technologies, ground-penetrating radar, 3D scanning, digital reconstruction, advanced materials analysis, are providing insights that earlier archaeologists could never have achieved. Our understanding of Pompeii continues to deepen, but the basic fact remains unchanged. This was a living city that died in a day, preserved by the same catastrophe that destroyed it, left as a message across the millennia about the power of nature and the fragility of human life. On quiet mornings at Pompeii, before the tourists arrive and the modern world intrudes, one can stand in the ancient streets and imagine that long-ago day when the mountain woke and the world changed forever. The ruts in the street are still there, worn by carts that will never roll again. The counters of the shops are still there, ready to serve customers who will never come. The frescoes on the walls still show their mythological scenes, their gardens and birds, their decorative patterns. The ghosts of Pompeii are almost tangible, the absent presence of all those lives that ended here, almost overwhelming in its silent testimony to catastrophe and loss. And yet the site is not only about death and destruction, it is also about life, about the vibrant, complex, ordinary, extraordinary life of a Roman provincial town, about people who loved and worked and worried and hoped, about communities and families and individuals making their way through the world as best they could. The catastrophe that preserved Pompeii allows us to see this life in detail that would otherwise be impossible, to connect across the centuries with people who, in all the ways that matter, were very much like us. They baked bread and raised children and conducted business and created art and tried to make sense of their world, just as we do. The fact that their world ended suddenly and completely does not diminish the reality and value of the lives they lived within it. The day the mountain woke, Pompeii died. But in dying it achieved a kind of immortality. Its moment preserved, its story told and retold, its lessons learned and relearned by generation after generation of those who come after. The people who died that August day in 79 AD could not have imagined that their city would become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, that millions would walk their streets and visit their homes, that their ordinary lives would be studied and discussed for 2 millennia. They lived for themselves and for each other, not for posterity. But posterity has claimed them nonetheless, finding in their preservation both a connection to the ancient world and a reminder of truths that transcend any particular time or place. That life is precious, that disaster can strike without warning, that human beings facing catastrophe respond with courage and fear, love and desperation, hope and resignation, and that the ordinary details of daily life, preserved against all odds, can speak across the centuries with surprising eloquence about what it means to be human.